It was an unseasonably warm morning in late April when Margaret Alden stepped out of the taxi and onto the paved courtyard of Willowbrook residence. The early sunlight filtered through budding maple trees, casting delicate patterns on the brick walkways. At 78, Margaret's once spry gait had slowed considerably. She steadied herself with a polished oak cane in her right hand. The weight of a single overnight bag rested against her hip, tethered by fatigue and uncertainty. Willowbrook residence stood in a quiet suburban neighborhood on the outskirts of the city. A broad, two-story building painted a muted cream color, its roof punctuated by small dormer windows. A sign above the front doors bore the name Willowbrook, in elegant cursive, with ivy winding around its letters. Margaret inhaled a deep, trepidatious breath, glancing to her left and right. Other residents trickled in alongside their family members, a man in his 80s leaning on a younger daughter's arm, a woman who looked only slightly older than Margaret, clutching a ceramic teacup, an elderly gentleman wearing a baseball cap, his eyes bright with curiosity. Behind the reception desk, a young woman with red hair and warm freckles glanced up and offered a gentle smile. "Good morning, Mrs. Alden. Welcome to Willowbrook. My name is Clara. I'll be your admissions coordinator today." Margaret nodded politely, her voice momentarily caught in her throat. "Good morning, Clara." "Thank you." She handed over a stack of papers, the admission forms, medical questionnaires, and an authorization for room assignment. Clara scanned through the documents, then motioned toward a plush, high-backed chair in a nearby seating area. While Margaret sat, Clara prepared her folder of information, giving quick instructions about meal times, medication schedules, and the layout of the facility. Margaret listened half-heartedly. Her mind wandered back to the apartment on Elm Street she had called home for nearly 5 decades. The freshly painted walls, the jagged cracks above the kitchen sink that she'd glued shut decades ago, the squeaky front door, each detail felt lodged in her heart. Now she was here, trading memories for routines she hardly understood. Clara's voice floated back to her. "Once you're settled in your room, there's a welcome luncheon in the dining hall at noon. You'll meet some of the staff and fellow residents. If you need anything before then, please let any of our aides know." Margaret managed a small smile. "Thank you. I will." She rose from the chair and followed Clara down a wide corridor decorated with framed paintings of pastoral landscapes. They passed a common area furnished with leather armchairs and low bookshelves brimming with large print novels. The corridor opened into a smaller hallway lined with the numbered doors. Clara slid a key into the lock of room 207. "This will be your room for now," Clara said, opening the door. "If you find anything uncomfortable, just let us know and we'll see what we can do." Margaret stepped inside. The room was modest. Twin bed with pale blue bedding, a small wooden nightstand, a window overlooking the garden courtyard, and a dresser topped with a lamp. Near the bed, a high-backed armchair provided a cozy reading nook. A walker leaned against the far wall. "It's very nice," Margaret said, her voice barely above a whisper. Clara offered her a reassuring smile. "I hope you'll find it comfortable. I'll let you unpack, and I'll be back this afternoon to see how you're doing." Alone, Margaret set her bag on the bed and carefully unpacked a few essentials: a framed photograph of her late husband, Robert, a small crocheted doily she'd made in 1975, and a collection of hardbound books, Agatha Christie mysteries, and Colleen McCullough's novels. These items would be enough to anchor her at first, she thought. She walked to the window and gazed at the courtyard below. A group of residents, some in wheelchairs, some with canes, sat at a circle of wrought iron tables, sipping coffee and chatting in hushed voices. Orange blossoms, newly planted, encircled the perimeter of the courtyard, giving off a faint, sweet fragrance. The sight stirred a pang of loneliness in Margaret's chest. Back at Elm Street, Robert used to tend to their rose bushes. He was gone now, 3 years and 4 months since his sudden heart attack. Margaret traced the outline of Robert's photograph with a trembling finger. "I hope you're okay, my love," she murmured. The afternoon sunlight warmed the far wall, and for a moment she closed her eyes and smelled home. Spices from the pantry, the faint, comforting aroma of Robert's aftershave. When Clara returned later that afternoon, she found Margaret seated by the window, lost in thought. Clara quietly set a tray of tea and biscuits on the nightstand. Mrs. Alden, if you'd like to freshen up, you can then join us for the welcome luncheon. There's roast chicken today, mashed potatoes, and broccoli. Do you have a roommate yet?" Margaret shook her head. "Not yet." Clara nodded. "The rooms are assigned as folks arrive. Yours will probably be hers soon. If you're comfortable, you can go down now. I can escort you, or you can take the elevator and head to the dining hall on your own." Margaret hesitated, then nodded. "I think I'll follow you, if that's all right." Clara smiled and offered her arm. Together they walked down the corridor through another common area where a pianist practiced Debussy and descended a gentle ramp into the dining hall. The room was bright, with pale yellow walls and large windows overlooking a koi pond. Tables were arranged in clusters of 4, each set with white tablecloths and colorful floral centerpieces. Margaret spotted a middle-aged nurse behind a counter, dishing portions of chicken onto plates. A low hum of conversation filled the air, greetings exchanged, laughter rising, compliments on the spring menu. Clara led Margaret to an empty seat beside a woman with silver hair styled in a neat bob. She looked to be around Margaret's age, perhaps 79 or 80, and she greeted Margaret with a kind smile. "Hello, dear. I'm Ellen Watkins. You must be new." Margaret offered a tentative smile. "Yes, I'm Margaret Alden. Nice to meet you." Ellen patted Margaret's hand. "Welcome to Willowbrook. You'll love it here, dear. The staff are kind, and the other residents are nice company. Have you lived in this area long?" Margaret nodded. "Nearly 50 years. My husband passed a few years ago, and my children, Emily and Thomas, persuaded me to move here." She paused, swallowing the lump in her throat. "I miss home." Ellen nodded sympathetically. "I understand. My husband died 5 years ago. The house felt so empty without him. But I found Willowbrook to be a blessing. Friends, activities, my grandchildren live far away, so it's nice to have company close by." Margaret felt a small measure of comfort in Ellen's words. They shared the meal, the tray of roast chicken and vegetables quickly disappearing. Ellen introduced her to neighboring tables, a retired schoolteacher named Harold, who had a soft laugh and a penchant for telling jokes, a former nurse, Beatrice, who loved to talk about the medical dramas she'd witnessed decades ago, and a duo of sisters, Ruth and Clara Simmons, identical twins who had turned 90 just last month and celebrated with cupcakes and balloons. By the time dessert was served, apple pie topped with a dollop of whipped cream, Margaret felt a lightness she hadn't experienced that morning. The gentle clinking of silverware, the warm chatter, and Ellen's encouraging presence began to ease her anxiety. After lunch, Margaret and Clara returned to the room. She unpacked a few more items, her knitting bag, a small ceramic lamp her daughter had given her on her last birthday, and a vase to hold a single daffodil arrangement that Clara had left on her dresser. Exhausted, Margaret sank into the armchair. She watched as the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the floor. She picked up her knitting, soft skeins of pale pink yarn, and began to stitch a simple scarf. The repetitive motion comforted her. In Elm Street, she used to knit socks for family members. Now she worked on the scarf, thinking that perhaps she could give it to Ellen, or to someone she had yet to meet. 2 days passed in a blur of routine, morning exercises led by a fitness aide, occupational therapy sessions focused on balance and strength, afternoon teas in the common room with cookie platters and old-time radio programs blaring in the background. Margaret discovered that Willowbrook offered a range of activities: weekly gardening club, art classes, movie nights, and occasional visits from local schoolchildren who performed songs and read stories. By the third morning, Margaret felt a gentle camaraderie brewing. Harold, the retired teacher, arrived at breakfast with a mismatched pair of socks, a humorous fashion statement he wore each day to lift spirits. "Morning, Margaret," he called out, sliding into the booth beside her. "I trust you slept well?" She chuckled. "I did, thank you. You?" Harold tapped his socks. "Never arrested. They're countless miles from matching, but they're always around." He winked, and Margaret laughed. Henrietta, the head cook, served oatmeal and fresh fruit. "Good morning, you two," she said. "On your plate today, bacon, eggs, and toast, or oatmeal, depending on how wild you feel." Margaret chose oatmeal with berries, while Harold opted for bacon and eggs. Over breakfast, Harold regaled her with tales from his teaching days. how he once had to hose down a custard cake child during class, how he discovered a passion for playwriting after inadvertently directing a high school production. Margaret found herself smiling more in those moments than she had in weeks. Still, in the quiet hours between activities, memories of Elm Street weighed on her. She spoke with Clara about housekeeping requests, extra towels, a smaller pillow, a larger calendar she could mark with dates. Clara accommodated each change with kindness. During one such request, Clara asked, "Would you like to join the gardening club? We plant flowers in raised beds so residents can tend them without bending too much." Margaret almost declined. She had always loved roses. She had mastered hybridizing miniature varieties back in her gardening days, but the idea of bending and kneeling made her hesitate. "I'm not sure if I can manage it," she admitted. Clara smiled reassuringly. "The beds are waist high. You can garden standing or seated. There's no pressure, just a chance to pot a few flowers and watch them grow." Margaret folded her hands and considered this. "I did love roses," she murmured. "In that case," Clara said, "I'll sign you up. The first meeting is tomorrow afternoon." Margaret nodded, determined. Perhaps a small patch of pansies or marigolds wouldn't hurt. The first gardening club meeting was scheduled for 3 p.m. in the greenhouse adjacent to the north wing. Harold accompanied Margaret, offering her his arm as she navigated the hallways. The greenhouse was a sunlit haven. Tall windows reached from floor to ceiling, and the air was warm with humidity and the scent of rich soil. Rows of raised beds, painted pale green, were filled with dark earth, waiting to be crowned with tender sprouts. A variety of pots lined wooden shelves, terracotta planters for geraniums, ceramic dishes for succulents, and pastel-painted buckets for herbs. An assistant named Daniel, a college student studying horticulture, greeted them with the gloves and gardening tools. "Welcome to the Willowbrook Gardening Club. I'm Daniel. Today we'll be planting marigolds, petunias, pansies, and herbs, basil, thyme, and mint. Feel free to choose your seeds and pots." Margaret's heart fluttered with a mix of excitement and gentle apprehension. She selected a packet of marigold seeds and a squat blue ceramic pot. Daniel helped her settle the pot on a stool at waist level. She gingerly dug her hands into the soil, feeling its cool grains sift through her fingers. She recalled Robert's calloused hands guiding her in their backyard garden, teaching her how to poke tiny holes with a pencil for each seed. She smiled, whispering thanks to those memories. As she planted seeds in neat rows, Harold tinkered with a small herb patch just beside her. "You know," he said in a low voice, "when I was teaching, I used to have a windowsill garden in my classroom. Basil and parsley. The kids would pinch off leaves and we'd make pesto in class. It's amazing how engaged they'd get over something as simple as herbs." Margaret nodded. "I always thought gardening could heal hearts. In our yard, roses and lilies grew in neat beds. My husband used to order new bulbs each year. Tulips, daffodils. He'd surprise me on spring mornings with potted primroses at the doorstep." They worked in comfortable silence, occasionally exchanging observations. How the light slanted through the glass roof, how the soil felt beneath their nails, how eager they were to see shoots appear. After finishing her marigold planting, Margaret looked at Harold's basil patch, noticing the rich, shiny leaves. "Your basil looks remarkable, Harold," she said. He grinned. "Not half as skilled as you. You grew roses, you said." "Yes, roses." Margaret paused, her gaze drifting upward toward the tinted glass ceiling. "It's been so long since I tended to any of them." Daniel came over, watering can in hand, and misted the beds gently. "Happy to have you two here. The greenhouse stays at a constant 75 degrees Fahrenheit, which is perfect for seedlings. Check back in a week or two, and you'll see sprouts." Margaret ran her fingers over the dark soil once more before rising to leave. Outside the greenhouse, a gentle breeze carried the scent of lilacs from the courtyard. She gazed at a nearby bench nestled beneath a blossoming cherry tree. Harold rested beside her, wiping a bead of sweat from his forehead. "Your eyes look brighter," he said. "See? Gardening works wonders." Margaret smiled, a sense of purpose blossoming within her. "Thank you, Harold. I might just try to keep these alive." He chuckled. "I'll help you if you need. We can check on them together." In the days that followed, Margaret's routine solidified into a comforting pattern. Morning stretches in the exercise room, occupational therapy sessions where she practiced standing unassisted for longer intervals, lunch in the dining hall with old friends and new acquaintances, afternoons spent in the greenhouse, and evenings reading by her bedside lamp. She found solace in the small glimmers of progress. A tiny green sprout pushing through the soil, her knitting scarf extending by another inch, a neighbor's joke that elicited an honest laugh rather than a polite smile. One morning, as Margaret sat on a bench overlooking the koi pond, a young woman approached her. She wore a lab coat and carried a clipboard. Dr. Priya Kapoor, the facility's geriatrician. "Morning, Miss Alden. May I have a moment?" Margaret stood, steadied by her cane. "Of course, doctor." Dr. Kapoor smiled kindly, placing a gentle hand on Margaret's shoulder. "I wanted to see how you're settling in. Your vitals look good, and your blood work from last week shows improvement in your vitamin levels. How are you feeling?" Margaret considered. "Physically, I feel okay. Sore in places I didn't know could be sore, but otherwise fine. Emotionally," she hesitated, her gaze drifting toward the glinting water below. "I'm still adjusting. Some days are easier than others." Dr. Kapoor nodded. "That's completely understandable. Transitions can be challenging. Have you spoken with our counselor, Ms. Lopez? She's available Tuesdays and Thursdays if you'd like to talk about grief, loneliness, anything that's weighing on you." Margaret's throat tightened. She had not given herself permission to talk about grief. Out loud, it sounded monumental. "Maybe," she said slowly. "I'll think about it. If you change your mind, just let me know." Dr. Kapoor patted her hand gently. "You're not alone here, Mrs. Alden. If there's anything you need, I'm just down the hall." Margaret watched her walk away as the doctor's white coat faded into the flurry of activity around the pond. She settled back onto the bench, feeling the slight warmth of the morning sun on her face. Late one afternoon, as the golden light filtered through the windows of the common room, Margaret spotted an old upright piano against the far wall. She remembered that once a week, a volunteer pianist named Samuel played classical pieces for residents. Today's sheet music still lay on the music rack, a partially open book of Chopin nocturnes. On impulse, she wheeled her chair closer and ran her fingers lightly over the ivory keys. A somber, slightly discordant note echoed through the room, drawing the attention of nearby residents. A tall older man with usually stern features softened when he saw Margaret. He rose from his wheelchair and approached her. "You play, ma'am?" Margaret turned, measuring him with a grateful tilt of her chin. "Only a little." She gestured toward the bench. "Please, sit." He complied, adjusting his hat as he settled. "I'm Edward Matthews. I haven't heard Chopin since my wife Lillian played for me." His voice wavered slightly, and Margaret sensed the vulnerability beneath his stoic facade. Margaret took a deep breath. "I learned some piano as a girl. Many years ago." She sat at the bench and placed her hands on the keys. Her fingers, unpracticed and a bit stiff, found the opening chords of Nocturne in E-flat major, Opus 9, number 2 Béonger. The notes were tentative at first, shaky, but as she progressed, they smoothed into a gentle flow. Edward closed his eyes, nodding as though the music reminded him of a time long past. As Margaret played, other residents drifted into the room. Beatrice, the former nurse, leaning on her walker, Ruth and Clara Simmons, their matching sweaters bright as tulips, Harold with a cup of tea in hand. The soft melody filled the room, weaving through memories and stirring emotions. When she finished, a hushed silence followed, broken by spontaneous applause. Edward cleared his throat, his eyes glistening. "Thank you, Miss Alden." Margaret removed her hands from the keys, tears brimming in her own eyes. "Thank you for listening." A volunteer caretaker, Josie, placed a freshly brewed pot of tea and a plate of cookies on a nearby table. "Miss Alden, you have such a gift. Would you consider playing again next week? It brightened everyone's spirits." Margaret smiled, though it felt fragile. "Perhaps." That evening, Margaret lay in bed and thought of Edward. His sudden tears, the way his shoulders had slumped as if a great weight had been lifted by hearing Chopin once more. She recalled how Lillian used to play for Robert and for her, their small parlor in Elm Street filled with music that lingered long after the keys fell silent. The next day, Margaret sought out Edward in the hallway by the dining hall. "Edward," she said softly, "I would be honored to play again this Friday." He paused, looking at her curiously. "Really?" She nodded. "Only if you think others would like it." Edward's stern expression softened into a tentative smile. "They would, and I would like it too." Margaret felt a swell of gratitude. She was forging connections here, through music and memory. Throughout the following weeks, Willowbrook's routines continued to weave together a tapestry of lives, residents sharing stories over morning coffee, the gardening club trading tips on composting, art classes where brushes danced across canvases, capturing flowers, portraits, and abstract imaginings. On Fridays, Margaret took her place at the piano, playing softly, sometimes Chopin, other times a gentle waltz by Strauss. Each time she noticed at least one face light up, one memory awakened, one smile reappear. One crisp morning, as Margaret sat knitting in her armchair, Ellen Watkins approached her, carrying a small envelope. "Margaret, dear, this was on the bulletin board." She handed over the letter, its crisp white paper and neat cursive writing standing out against the cork background. Margaret recognized her daughter's handwriting instantly. Emily. She unfolded the letter, scanning the lines. "Dearest Mom, we're thinking of you and hope you're settling in. Well, Thomas and I are planning a visit next weekend. We saved some daffodil bulbs from Dad's favorite patch. We thought you might like to plant them somewhere at Willowbrook. Let us know if there's a good spot. Love always, Emily and Tom Tears, misted in Margaret's eyes." Memories of Robert planting daffodils in their backyard flooded her mind. How each spring his face would light up at the first green shoots, how he would gently cradle the yellow blossoms in his palm and press one between his necklace chain so she could wear its warmth close to her heart. Now, her children carried on that tradition, wanting her to plant the bulbs in the courtyard. That afternoon, Margaret found Daniel in the greenhouse and asked if there was room for a small daffodil bed. Daniel smiled. "Absolutely. We can dedicate a patch just next to your marigolds. We'll prepare the soil and mark it." Margaret felt a flood of emotion, joy laced with sorrow. That night, she sat by her window and traced Robert's face in her mind. Emily and Thomas's visit next weekend would be the first time they'd all been together under the same roof in months. She resolved to clean her room, pick out a special outfit, maybe the pale pink cardigan she had knitted that winter, and open herself to the warmth they brought. On Saturday morning, a gentle spring rain fell, tapping against the window pane. Margaret lingered over breakfast, watching droplets slide down the glass. She felt a flutter of anticipation. She wondered if Thomas would bring his camera, as he used to, capturing candid moments to print and hang at her place on Elm Street. Perhaps he'd take pictures of her and the garden, her and the piano, her and her newfound friends. When Emily and Thomas arrived mid-morning, they wasted no time embracing their mother. Emily pressed a damp kiss to Margaret's cheek. "Mother, you look radiant." Thomas set down a small wooden crate filled with soil and a bundle of tightly wrapped daffodil bulbs. "Dad would have liked these. We made sure to bring them on time." Margaret guided them to the greenhouse where Daniel helped prepare a new raised bed. Together, the three of them sank the bulbs into the rich earth, arranging them in neat rows next to the marigolds. Emily dabbed a tear from her mother's cheek, and Thomas snapped a photograph. Margaret on the far left, a gentle smile on her lips. Emily kneeling beside her, and Thomas behind them, holding his camera aloft to capture the moment. "It's perfect," Margaret said, pressing a daffodil bulb into the soil. "Thank you." Emily squeezed her hand. "We wanted you to feel at home here." In the days that followed, Margaret's children visited often, bringing home-baked pies, sharing stories of their busy lives, and helping her make small repairs to the wooden frame of her raised bed. On one visit, Thomas surprised her with a digital picture frame loaded with family photos. Robert cradling newborn Thomas, family vacations at the lake, Christmas dinners where Margaret wore a green velvet dress, and Robert held a tiny gingerbread cookie in her direction. The frame sat on her dresser, rotating images every few seconds like a looping movie. Through all this, Margaret's heart felt lighter. The presence of her children, the planted daffodils, the digital memories swirling on the frame, they reminded her that life, though fragile, also blossomed in unexpected moments. Just as spring bled into early summer, a stretch of unrelenting heat waves blanketed the region. Willowbrook's air conditioning struggled to keep pace. One afternoon, as Margaret sat knitting by her window, she noticed the sky darken far in the west. Rumors of a severe thunderstorm circulated among residents, possible hail, power outages, and heavy rain. Staff announcements crackled over the intercom. Attention residents, due to approaching weather, please avoid the courtyard and remain indoors until further notice. All activities are canceled this afternoon. Thank you, Margaret set aside her knitting and made her way to the common room, where several residents gathered, Harold flipping through the newspaper, Beatrice sipping iced tea, Edward leaning back in his wheelchair. The air felt heavy, oppressive, as if the threatened storm already pressed against the windows. A sudden flash of lightning lit up the sky, followed by a distant rumble of thunder. The lights flickered once, then steadied. Residents exchanged uneasy glances. Beatrice set her cup down. I remember one storm back home, years ago. The power went out and I sat in the dark, wondering if the old tree in our yard would fall on the roof. Harold adjusted his hat and offered a comforting smile. We'll be fine here. The building's modern, solid. Still, I'd like some cookies, if you don't mind. Beatrice chuckled. Coming right up! She shuffled toward the small kitchen area at the back of the room. Margaret felt a pang of restlessness. She rose and walked to the opposite side of the room, where she noticed a young maintenance worker, Mr. Finch, inspecting the backup generator near the electrical panel. She approached him. Mr. Finch, how likely is it that the power will go out? He glanced over his shoulder. It's possible if the winds pick up. But we've checked the breakers and the generator. It should kick in immediately if the main supply fails. Margaret nodded, her concern easing slightly. Thank you. As the minutes passed, lightning and thunder exploded intermittently, rattling the windows. Wind whipped tree branches against the glass. Suddenly a loud crack of thunder sounded, and the lights went out. The common room plunged into dimness, save for the slanting of natural light trickling through the windows. A collective gasp rose among the residents. Beatrice, lighting a few battery-powered lanterns, moved quickly to brighten the space. Stay calm, everyone, she said. The staff will have the generator up and running soon. Margaret felt the walls of her chest tighten with anxiety. Although the room was secure, the noise of the storm made her nervous. She gripped the arms of her chair, glancing at Harold beside her. His usually cheerful face looked pale. A few minutes later, the hum of the backup generator roared to life, and the overhead lights flickered on. A round of relief rose among the residents. Just then, the fire alarm screeched, a high piercing sound that cut through the residual thunder. Beatrice jumped. What now? The alarm repeated in staccato beeps. Mr. Finch, with a flashlight strapped to his head, hurried toward the exit door. It must have been a false alarm or a malfunction due to the surge. We'll check it out. Please stay here. Margaret sucked in a breath. A false alarm during a storm? Could there be a fire? She glanced at Edward, whose face was pale with worry. The staff ushered residents into the hallway, guiding those in wheelchairs or with walkers. A nurse, Ms. Lopez, the counselor, approached Margaret. Mrs. Alden, let's get you to a safe area. Please follow me. The hallway lights flickered but remained on. Residents moved down the corridor to a designated safe room used for emergencies. As Margaret walked, the storm continued to rage outside. Rain pelted the windows and the wind howled. Inside the small meeting room, 20 residents sat in chairs arranged in a circle. The emergency supplies, bottles of water, granola bars, and battery-powered lanterns sat on a table at the front. Margaret found a seat between Harold and Beatrice. Harold offered her a reassuring nod. Beatrice patted her hand. These storms can be frightening, but we'll get through. Everyone sat in tense silence for several minutes. A staff member opened the door, holding out a clipboard. All staff present? Good. Fire alarm is confirmed false. Just a faulty sensor, triggered by the surge. It's safe to return to your rooms now. Thank you for your patience. The residents sighed in collective relief. Some chuckled nervously. Beatrice set her lit lantern on the table as they filtered back to the common room. Outside, though the rain persisted, the thunderstorm's worst had passed. Margaret returned to her room that evening feeling a mix of relief and exhaustion. She looked at the dim glow of her digital picture frame. An image of her and Robert at their 50th wedding anniversary flickered on screen, both of them smiling brightly. She missed the predictability of her old life, where storms meant closing windows and lighting candles, not false alarms and generator surges. Yet, the experience also reminded her that she was not alone. Staff and residents alike cared for one another when times grew frightening. In the days following the storm, life at Willowbrook eased back into its gentle rhythm. Although the thunderstorm washed away the heavy heat, the air remained warm, and the courtyard's newly planted daffodils seemed to lift their heads in gratitude. One morning, Margaret joined the art class, a new activity she had been curious about. The room was bright, filled with easels, paintbrushes, and jars of water. At the head of the table stood Mrs. Chen, a petite woman in her 60s with gentle eyes and quick, precise gestures. Welcome, everyone. Today we'll explore watercolor techniques. Grab your brushes and paper. Margaret settled at an easel next to Edward. Neither of them had signed up for art. They were both trying something new. Margaret placed a small bowl of water, a few tubes of paint, and a stack of paper on her workstation. She glanced at Edward, who appeared focused on mixing colors. Mrs. Chen guided the class through the basics, wetting the brush, choosing hues, creating gradients. Margaret tentatively painted the outline of a daffodil, the same ones she had planted with her children. As the yellow pigment pooled on the paper, she carefully dabbed along the petals, letting the color bleed into delicate gradients. Edward experimented with a watercolor landscape, trees reflected in water. Midway through the class, Edward looked over at Margaret's painting. "Yours is lovely. Daffodils, right?" Margaret nodded, eyes on her brush. "I planted some in the greenhouse last week." Edward smiled. "They're special flowers. My wife loved them." Margaret's hand stilled on the brush. "Mine 2 years ago." They painted in companionable silence after that, occasionally sharing a stroke of insight or a chuckle when the paint splashed unexpectedly. At the end of the session, Mrs. Chen invited everyone to display their works. Margaret's daffodil painting, though imperfect, captured the gentle arch of the petals and the vibrant yellow hue. Edward's landscape, too, glowed with the promise of summer. When the class concluded, another resident, Mr. Patel, an engineer with thick glasses and a booming laugh, approached them. "Those are beautiful. You two make quite the team." Margaret blushed at the compliment. "Thank you." Mr. Patel. Edward turned to her. "Let's go have tea. I want to talk about Lillian's daffodils." Margaret nodded, packing her supplies. They headed toward the common room, laughing about spilled paint, lingering tension, and the surprising joy of trying something new. Over tea and lemon cookies, Edward shared stories of his wife Lillian's garden. She had this patch of white daffodils by our front porch. Every spring, I'd wake up to her humming a tune, clipping a few blooms, and arranging them in a crystal vase for me. It was the first thing I saw when I left for work. He paused, clearing his throat. It reminded me that beauty endures, even through hardships. Margaret nodded, sipping her tea. Robert used to grow pink and yellow roses. One year he surprised me with a bouquet of pink climbers he'd trained in an arch over our front gate. He called them lover's vines. She chuckled. Sometimes he'd bring me one while I was asleep, tuck it behind my ear. Edward sighed. I wish I could have given Lillian more years. Margaret reached across the tea table and touched his hand. She'd be proud of you for keeping her memory alive. From that morning onward, Margaret and Edward formed an unlikely friendship, gardening allies by day, art companions by afternoon, storytellers by night. They held a small plant sale in the courtyard, offering marigolds and daffodils to other residents. Beatrice purchased a pot of marigolds, Ruth and Clara each took a few herb pots, and Harold claimed a lush basil plant for his bedside table. One afternoon, Margaret received a note slipped under her door. Opening it, she saw Emily's neat script. Mom, we're having a small family reunion at my place next weekend. Grandchildren are coming. Would you like to join? No pressure. Just thought I'd ask. Love, Emily. Margaret held the note close, feeling a tug of homesickness. The idea of leaving Willowbrook for a weekend filled her with both longing and reluctance. The thought of returning to Elm Street, even if just briefly, brought forth images of dusty, sunlit corridors, the scent of Robert's old tools in the garage, and the soft hum of the kitchen radio that had fallen silent. But she also knew her children's request came from love. That evening, she found Dr. Kapoor in the hallway. "Doctor, I received a note from Emily. She's having a reunion and wants me to come. I'm torn. I'm settled here now, but I don't want to disappoint her." Dr. Kapoor smiled warmly. "It's understandable to feel conflicted. Weekend visits are possible. Transportation can be arranged. If you're comfortable, I encourage you to go. It might help you process grief and maintain family bonds." Margaret nodded slowly. "I'll think about it. Thank you." That night, Margaret sat in her armchair, the digital photo frame cycling through images: her wedding day, Robert's retirement celebration, her daughter's graduation, the recent picture of her, Emily and Thomas planting daffodils. She missed them acutely. She decided that attending the reunion, embracing both love and sorrow, was the path forward. On that Saturday morning, a family van arrived to transport her to Emily's home. Emily and Thomas hovered by her side as she climbed in, tucking her scarf around her shoulders. As the van pulled away from Willowbrook, Margaret waved through the window at Ellen, Harold, and Edward, who stood near the gate, waving back. A pang of sadness struck her, but also pride. She belonged to many families now, her biological one, and the community she'd found at Willowbrook. Emily's home buzzed with activity. 3 grandchildren running between the living room and kitchen, their laughter rising above the clamor of pots and pans. Thomas's wife Rachel bustled about preparing snacks. Emily embraced her older sister Lucy, who had driven in from college. Margaret felt the world shift, alive with younger generations growing and changing. During a lunch, Emily carved slices of roasted chicken, while Lucy poured water for everyone. The grandchildren peppered Margaret with questions. "Tell us about grandfather's daffodils." "Granny, can you teach us to knit?" "What was it like when you and Grandpa met?" Margaret's heart swelled as she shared small memories. How she and Robert danced cheek to cheek under fireworks, how they had picnics in the backyard, how they carved their initials into an oak tree that still stood tall. Now, her legacy felt alive in the smiling faces around her. After lunch, they ventured into the backyard. Emily had a small patch of daffodil bulbs ready for planting. Margaret guided her daughters and grandchildren as they dug the soil. She lifted a bulb, whispering, "These are the last ones my father-in-law, Richard, sent me before he passed. Plant them gently." The grandchildren carefully placed each bulb, patting the earth above with solemn concentration. Later, Lucy asked Margaret to teach her knitting. Margaret smiled, handing her a ball of yarn and a pair of needles. Lucy's fingers fumbled at first, but under Margaret's patient guidance, she formed a simple knit stitch. Soon, a small strip of stitches emerged, each one a triumph. Margaret felt a surge of joy, life bridging generations through shared craft. As dusk fell, the family gathered on the back porch. Thomas strummed a guitar while Emily and Lucy sang "You Are My Sunshine" in soft harmonies. Margaret leaned back in a rocking chair, feeling both the weight of her years and the warmth of familial love. She realized that grief and joy were intertwined threads, each making the other more vivid. When the time came to return to Willowbrook, Emily and Thomas helped Margaret back into the van. She pressed the daffodil bed's memory into her heart, knowing the bulbs she'd planted would flourish there. As they drove away, she looked at her daughters, her son-in-law, and her granddaughter, her family, and then out the window at the world beyond. Returning to Willowbrook the next morning, Margaret found the courtyard bathed in golden sunlight. The daffodil bed, tended by Daniel and Harold during her absence, already showed fresh green shoots. She smiled, feeling a sense of home. Edward waited by the greenhouse, watering his basil patch. When he saw her, he set the watering can aside and offered a small tin box. "Welcome back. I thought you might like a gift." Margaret opened the box to find a pair of antique silver knitting needles, lightweight yet elegantly crafted, and a skein of soft cream-colored yarn. "I saw these at a yard sale last week," Edward explained. "They reminded me of your knitting. Thought you'd enjoy them." Tears glimmered in Margaret's eyes. "Thank you, Edward. This means so much." He shrugged modestly. "You inspire all of us." Margaret tucked the needles into her bag and turned to see Harold approaching with a small wooden plaque carved with the words, Daffodil Garden. "I made this," he said, handing it to her. "We can place it by your bulbs." Margaret hugged him gratefully. "You're too kind." In the weeks that followed, the daffodil bulbs burst into bloom, bright clusters of golden trumpets rising above the soil as if heralding the arrival of summer. Residents paused to admire them. Beatrice picked a few petals to press into her scrapbook. Ruth and Clara admired their symmetry. Harold harvested a sprig of basil and tucked it behind his ear. Edward played Daffodil Dance, a jaunty tune he composed for his granddaughter. One evening, the staff organized an outdoor summer fete in the courtyard. Tables with white tablecloths were set under a canopy of string lights. A small band of local musicians played soft jazz by the koi pond. Grill aromas drifted through the air, and the scent of fresh marigolds mingled with laughter. Margaret arrived wearing her cream-colored scarf knitted on those new silver needles and a light blue blouse embroidered with daisies. Harold greeted her first, offering a small bouquet of daisies he snipped from the greenhouse selection. Ellen, in a crimson sundress, handed Margaret a glass of lemonade. Edward approached, bowing with mock formality. "May I have this dance?" Margaret laughed, accepting his arm as Harold led the way to a small dance floor. Gently, Edward guided her to the rhythm of a slow waltz. The music swirled, and as they turned, Margaret felt both the thrill of youth and the wisdom of age intertwine. She looked into Edward's eyes and saw reflections of shared memories, daffodils planted with trembling fingers, Chopin's nocturnes echoing through the common room, the storm that had bound them together. After the dance, Margaret held her breath and spoke softly. "Edward, I want to thank you for everything. For your music, your friendship, your kindness." Edward smiled, his eyes glistening. "No, Margaret. Thank you for sharing your light with all of us." Across the courtyard, Dr. Kapoor, Miss Lopez, and Clara watched them with warm smiles. Tonight was a celebration not only of summer's warmth, but of resilience, community, and the unexpected joys that come with forging new connections later in life. As the fete continued, residents clapping along to jazz standards, children from visiting families chasing fireflies, staff mingling with guests, Margaret felt a profound sense of gratitude. She had arrived at Willowbrook scared and uncertain, clutching the memories of her past tightly. Now, surrounded by her newfound family, she realized that life's tapestry is woven not with solitary threads, but with interlacing strands of shared experiences, both joyful and sorrowful. Later, as the stars emerged overhead, Margaret returned to her room. The daffodil painting she'd created in art class hung above her bed. Next to it, Edward's original score for Daffodil Spring was framed and leaned against the nightstand. On her dresser, the digital photo frame cycled through images, family moments and Willowbrook memories, Emily planting bulbs with her grandchildren, Harold's basil harvest, Ellen's crimson sundress twirling on the dance floor. Margaret settled into her armchair, knitting the final stitches on a pale pink scarf she intended to donate to the nursing staff. She gazed around the room with a gentle smile. The scent of fresh flowers drifted in from her open window. Through the pane, she could hear distant laughter as the fete wound down. Somewhere in the background, Edward's piano rang out a soft nocturne, and she closed her eyes, letting the music wash over her. Several weeks later, as autumn's first chill settled over Willowbrook, Margaret and Edward co-hosted the inaugural recital of the Willowbrook Music Circle. Family members of residents attended, seated in folding chairs lined beneath a canopy of golden leaves. Edward conducted from the piano bench, while Margaret accompanied some of the singers on guitar, another skill she had honed in the spring. When their daughter Lucy performed a violin solo she had learned under Margaret's patient tutelage, she began by introducing herself. "I'm Lucy Alden, and this piece is dedicated to my grandmother Margaret, who taught me that age is never a barrier to learning." The audience erupted in applause as Lucy's bow danced across the strings, the music carrying through the courtyard like a heartfelt declaration of love. After the recital, Emily, Thomas, and their children strolled through the daffodil bed. The flowers, now in their last bloom before winter's rest, waved gently in the breeze. Emily bent to pick a single stem, pressing its golden trumpet to her nose. "Just like Dad would have wanted," she said softly. Margaret watched them and felt the fullness of her life, past, present, and future meld into a single tapestry. She turned back to Edward, who offered her a small bouquet of marigolds and daisies. "For you," he said, "for all you've given us." Tears of gratitude pricked her eyes. She took the flowers and tucked them into her cardigan pocket. "Thank you," she whispered. As the sun dipped behind the trees, casting long shadows across the courtyard, Margaret Alden stood amid a community that had become her family. The daffodils, now fading, would rest until spring returned. But the connections she had cultivated, like seeds planted in fertile soil, would endure through every season to come. And in that moment, she knew that her story was still unfolding, page by page, note by note, bloom after bloom. If this story touched your heart, please consider liking, subscribing, and sharing it with someone who needs a little warmth today.